You're on mute, Anne.
Oh, sorry for that. We are at 10:05. I propose that we begin. I'll record the session for those who will be joining us so that they can refer after this. But I propose that we begin for now. So thank you for joining us today. For attendees, my name is Anne Maina. I'm the program assistant for the Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa. And I'll start off the session by just introducing NERA and then give you a little bit of an overview of our agenda for today. And then I'll introduce our speaker for the day. Great. So, just a brief overview of who we are. NERA is an independent network of East African scholars who conduct decision-focused evaluations for social and economic development programs. So our members are ideally alumni of the East African Social Translation Fellowship that is hosted at the University of California, Berkeley. And right now our work is actually anchored on 3 pillars, that is capacity building, evidence generation, and policy outreach. And in terms of capacity building, some of you may have attended our impact evaluation trainings where we purpose to build the capacities of different audiences in impact evaluations. So just to tie you to what you're doing today, that is tied to a pillar on evidence generation. We conduct decision-focused evaluations and studies that actually are intended to influence the policy-making environment. And today with us, we have Dr. Michael Mbato, who will be giving us a presentation on key findings of a systematic review that he has conducted in the education and governance sector. And that should be it, just to give you an idea of who we are. We are currently hosted at the University, United States International University here in Nairobi, Kenya. So once again, thank you for joining us. I'll be sharing our social media platforms as we go on. And in terms of the agenda of the session today, we are going to have a presentation, as I've mentioned, from Dr. Michael Mbate, and then we'll have a Q&A section, and then we'll close the session afterwards. So thank you once again. I'll take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Michael Mbate to proceed.
Thank you, Anne, for the presentation. So let me try to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the next maybe 20, 30 minutes, I'm going to do a short presentation on fiscal decentralization and education outcomes, which is evidence from a systematic review conducted in Sub-Saharan Africa. And basically what we are trying to examine is whether like decentralization has any positive, negative, or null effects on education outcomes. And we are going to try to answer that question by sort of evaluating studies that have been conducted in the African context and trying to see whether we can learn from the current evidence that we do have. Okay, so from like a very basic point of view, decentralization refers to the transfer of power and authority from the central to subnational level of governance. So this implies that the central government has to relinquish its authority over planning, management, and decision-making to like lower levels of governance, such as constituencies, municipalities, districts, or provinces. And the decentralization reform is sort of recent, but also a common agenda in most low and middle income countries, In the Kenyan context, this is what happened with the new constitution in 2013. Countries like Uganda have had like some sort of decentralized governance since 1997 with like the local governments. The same with South Africa as it is sort of moved away from apartheid, and even going back to Ghana in the 1980s. And a lot of African countries have sort of tried to implement some level of decentralization reforms. However, and one of the motivations for this study is that there are mixed results on whether decentralizing these sort of powers from the central to local government has any influence on governance or development outcomes. And existing studies show like a mixed sort of evidence, and there are actually 4 reasons to explain this sort of behavior. One is from a conceptual point of view, it's just difficult to define what is decentralization. And this means that evaluating its impact it's just difficult because we are not sure about the different sorts of definitions which are in the literature. And this is something that we are going to try to dig into in the next slides. A second issue is just how to measure decentralization. There are like different measures of it. There's no consensus on how to measure. There are different proxies used in the literature, and this just complicates evaluating its impact. Third reason comes down to empirical issues in analysis, and this is related to causality. As we continue this series on impact evaluation, the issue of correlation versus causality comes into play, and trying to disentangle from a causal perspective whether decentralization and not any other policy or intervention has an impact on outcomes of interest is an issue. And then the final point is about joint responsibilities. So in most systems of decentralization, even if local governments have the authority and power to plan and manage and make decisions, as we have defined earlier, the central government also have a role to play. So it's not very easy to disentangle which responsibility belongs to the central government and what belongs to the local government. And you can sort of think of, if you have a blackout, a power blackout tomorrow, who should you blame? Is it your local politicians or is it the central government? So these are like the sort of things which actually do complicate how to evaluate governance outcomes in terms of decentralization. So the objective of this presentation, which stems from the systematic analysis, is one, to discuss the theoretical and policy debate about decentralization. So we are going to focus on like current studies which do highlight what we can learn from previous interventions from a theoretical perspective. And then the second objective of the presentation is to try to see what the evidence says about the link between decentralization and public service delivery in terms of education outcomes. So these are like the 2 things which we are going to sort of talk about. All right, so when we talk about decentralization, what exactly do we mean? So decentralization can be sort of subdivided into 4 aspects. 1, it's delegation. 2, deconcentration. 3, devolution. And 4, privatization. And going to the first one on delegation, this is actually a transfer of managerial responsibilities from the central government to other agencies in the government, but often at a temporary aspect. So this could be like a parastatal being given powers or authorities to accomplish a certain perspective. And this is often something that the central government can retrieve at any point in time. So it's just from the typical sense of the word to delegate. There's another concept of decentralization that is deconcentration. And this is actually a transfer of administrative powers, but not political powers. So you could think of counties or municipalities which have constitutional mandate to do certain managerial or admin work, but they actually don't have like the political powers to call any shots. The third one is devolution, which means a transfer of financial administrative powers in a permanent way. So this is actually something that is entrenched in a constitution, and the central government cannot recall it without a referendum. So this is like the example of Kenya, where counties do have budgets and like a financial and admin powers to make policies and run their own affairs. The last form of decentralization is privatization, where there's a transfer of ownership from the government to the private sector. And this is actually more common either in hospitality, such as hospitals, or the education sector. And on the right-hand side, there's a arrow that shows the degree of autonomy. And the more we move from delegation to privatization, the more powers are being delegated away from the central government to other actors such as local governments or the private sector. So these are like the general forms of modes of decentralization in most African countries. They do differ in the European context, but more or less this is, from a conceptual point of view, what we should try to think of. Okay, so what is the theory behind decentralization and governance? So from a theoretical point of view, there are some people or some authors, scholars, studies, evidence, which links decentralization to positive effects on governance and public service provision. And these sort of studies or theories focus on 4 key aspects. 1, decentralization can improve governance and or public service provision by increasing the degree of political competition. There are studies that show that the link between decentralization and governance occurs through public accountability. There are other studies that emphasize the link between decentralization and political responsiveness. And then there's a strand of literature that also tries to argue that decentralization is good for governance and public service delivery because it enhances political stability. So in the next slides, I'm going to briefly discuss each of these points. But the key aim is to sort of think of this taxonomy as a conceptualization of why we should think that transferring powers from the central to local government should actually have any impact at all. So let's see the first theory on the link between decentralization and political competition. So a couple of studies have emphasized that decentralization leads to political competition by deepening two things. One, the level, and two, the nature of political competition. And how does this occur? So one, this occurs through political entrepreneurship. And this is where decentralization creates more avenues and opportunities for individuals to join the political arena and compete for electoral positions. So this in turn creates a pool of competitive candidates who seek elective positions, and thus increases the incentives to align their own policies with the preferences of the voters. And this is what we've seen, especially in the Kenyan context, when decentralization was introduced, there were like more people vying for elections. So that creates a spirit of entrepreneurship, not in the business sense, but in a political sense, where individuals whom voters did not know are actually vying up for political positions and trying to join politics. The second reason is that with decentralization, there's a formation of multiple political parties. And what this implies is that voters have the opportunity to switch from one party to another, depending on their manifesto, their goals, and their objectives. So this is actually something that is positive from voters' perspective. Then third, there's a creation of an opposition. So in decentralization, those people who are vying for positions and don't get elected, what we call electoral losers, can actually become watchdogs and sort of monitor what the incumbents or like those who won are doing, and they can sort of hold them accountable. So this actually creates incentives for incumbents to perform, because those who lost the elections are closely monitoring their actions, and they can actually challenge them in the next elections. So this is briefly what decentralization can do to sort of deepen governance outcomes and public service delivery through the channel of political competition. The second aspect, which we saw from the graph, is the link between decentralization and public service delivery through public accountability. So those who advocate for decentralization do argue that it's good because ultimately politicians are more accountable to the local citizens. And there are actually three reasons for this sort of accountability mechanism. The first one is downward accountability. So in terms of decentralization, what this does is it places the fate of local politicians in the hands of the local electorate. So as a consequence, it reorients the flow of power, where local officials are no longer accountable to the central government, but they are more accountable to local citizens in their jurisdictions or in their local municipalities. Second, the accountability mechanism happens in the sense that local citizens can better monitor the quantity and quality of public goods and services that their local politicians are providing, and they're in a better position to see whether they are performing well or not. Then the third point is about upward mobility. So in most cases, when a country decentralizes its governance, local leaders do have incentives to perform well so that they can vie for positions in the central government. And for instance, in the Kenyan case, we see that local governors or senators who are performing well are increasingly trying to vie for positions in the central government. So decentralization gives an opportunity for people to perform well at the local level so that they can actually try to have incentives to proceed forward in terms of their political careers. The third point is about political responsiveness. And what this means is that decentralization is good because local leaders are now responsive to local needs. And the key point is that decentralization leads to better targeting of public goods and services. And this occurs through 4 key channels. And the basic idea is that local leaders have more information about local needs and preferences. So there is no much information asymmetry. So they can actually provide goods and services that are in line with what local citizens want. Then second, because of decentralization, there's more frequent interactions between leaders and the citizens, so information can be passed on in a low-cost manner, and then this information can also be verified. And then finally, decentralization leads to fewer coordination problems because the central government is not involved. So local politicians and bureaucrats at the district level or county level can make decisions quicker compared to having to wait for the central government, which is located in an urban setting to make decisions. So the responsiveness is really quick. Then the final link between decentralization and good governance boils down to political stability. And the key idea is that with decentralization, there's more political and ethnic stability. And again, in the Kenyan context, this was one of the key motivations of the devolution reform, which was enacted in 2013. And the key premise is that local societies which had previously been marginalized against social or political or economic lines and now do have like the powers to make budgetary decisions, to control local resources. So by giving them powers to make these sort of decisions, you sort of lessen the ethnic and political tensions which do exist in a country. And then finally, in countries where people do associate themselves along ethnic or religious lines, by decentralization, you can actually reorganize the way people think of themselves away from this sort of ethnic, religious privileges to more governance aspects. So for instance, in the Kenyan context again, most people would say, I'm from Makueni County, instead of saying I'm a Kamba, or I'm from this county, instead of saying their ethnic group. So it's good in a way that people sort of associate themselves with more governance outcomes or settings and less of their ethnic or social or class identity. So just scrolling back, this emphasizes why countries are increasingly moving to decentralization, because it has these positive outcomes. But this is more of the theory and policy, and what we are going to discuss later is whether this actually translates into practice. But this is actually like a snapshot of what I think you should recall in the discussions and in your questions, and as you move forward, sort of trying to think of what decentralization is and what it means. However, as we know, and as theory argues, there are also negative effects of decentralization. So it's not just a policy reform that can lead to these sort of positive outcomes. It can also lead to negative outcomes. And from the systematic review that I did, there are actually 4 channels through which decentralization can be a bad policy for countries or governments. And this can happen through 1, political capture; 2, a reduction in the quality of public policies; 3, an increased tension and conflicts between different levels of the government; and 4, decentralization can actually make regional inequalities increase rather than decline. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to briefly discuss each of these channels. But what I want you to actually grasp is that decentralization is not as good as people sort of advocate for. And these are like the channels which like we have to conceptualize as we think about the debate. So the first one is about political capture. So decentralization is actually bad for governance because it increases capture by local elites and special interest groups. And what does this mean? So 1, when you decentralize resources, especially budgets, aka money to local government, this increases corruption and rent seeking. So it's not just that the central government is corrupt, but also subnational governments such as counties, districts, municipalities are now engaging in corruption. And this is not just an issue of money being siphoned off for private gains, but there's actually an effect on social welfare. So local citizens are actually having less access to public services because our money is being wasted. Then thirdly, this sort of local elites and special interest groups can capture decentralization through political dynasties. And what this means is that once a certain local politician leaves the office, the incumbent would be somebody from the family network. So actually, there's a dynasty which has been created such that when a politician leaves power, the person who ends up replacing that person has some personal ties and networks to them. And then finally, because civil society organizations do play a key role in trying to enhance governance outcomes in those subnational governments where these organizations are absent, then local elites can steal money and nobody will ever know because these organizations are missing in action. The second channel through which decentralization has negative effects on governance and public service provision is through the reduction in the quality of public services. And what this means is that when a country decentralizes its decision-making processes, then the problem is that local governments do not have the capacity, do not have the technical skills or the administrative expertise to make decisions. So actually, it ends up being a bad reform to begin with. And then secondly, decentralization reduces economies of scale because each local district or subnational government has to make decisions on its own. But if it was in the case of centralization, then the central government would have been in a better position to do that. So for instance, think of creating a road from Mombasa to Kisumu. A central government can easily do that. But if we are operating in a decentralized system and each county has to do it, then it becomes difficult for that road to actually be built across counties. So there's this sort of decrease in economies of scale. And then the last point is about absorptive capacity in the sense that local governments cannot even spend the money that they are being allocated for. So they actually don't have the capacity to either design or spend what they should do. The third mechanism why decentralization is actually bad is because it leads to conflicts and tensions across different levels of governance. And what this means is that by definition, decentralization means that the central government has to relinquish power to local authorities. And this is actually something difficult to do by definition. So the first point which I made is conflict in the distribution of government resources. And what this means is that the central government has issues trying to design a good formula to allocate resources to local governments. Then second is that the central government is not really sure about how to relinquish some functions and responsibilities to local governments. And even if they do, then the third point is that it's not entirely clear who should receive any credit or blame for any policy outcomes. And what this means is, if you think of like tomorrow and there's a power blackout, who should you blame? Is it your local politician? Is it the Ministry of Energy? Is it the parastatal? Is it like the power company? So it's not really sure like or clear who you should blame for any positive or negative effect, because some of these public goods and services are being co-financed by both the central and local government. So this sort of creates a conflict and tension of who's actually responsible for what and who should get credit for what or not. And then the final point is that decentralization can actually increase regional inequalities, and this can happen through three channels. One is initial conditions, which means that those subnational governments which were better off before the decentralization can actually continue being better off. Second is that urban areas always perform better than rural areas. So if you think of Addis Ababa or Nairobi or Kampala and Entebbe compared to more rural areas, you can actually see that these urban areas just perform well. They do receive more money. That's where more of the action is. That's where the central government is located. So urban areas are just better off. So decentralization actually increases this divide. And then finally, there's this point about the central government distributing resources to subnational governments which are of political interest to them. So if, for instance, in the Kenyan context, you are from the central province where you are aligned to the central government in terms of partisanship with the president, you are more likely to get favors compared to other regions that are controlled by the opposition. So this can lead to regional inequalities. So to go back to the slides I presented earlier, again, let's remember that decentralization is bad for governance because of political capture and corruption, poor public policies because local governments don't have the capacity, tensions among the central and local government because of distribution of resources or decision-making processes, or regional inequalities in the sense that regions that are better off in terms of urbanization continue being better compared to rural areas. So what does this mean? So to conclude, from a theoretical perspective or a policy perspective, we just have mixed evidence on what decentralization can accomplish and what it cannot accomplish. And this is because of just the complexity of the reform in itself. And also the point that I'm going to be making in the next couple of slides is that whether decentralization is good or not depends on what we call preconditions. So in more econometric terms, that would be interaction. So there's actually some factors which can make decentralization good and bad. So it's not an issue of decentralization per se, but some of the factors that do underline decentralization in itself. And what these factors are is actually the outcome of this systematic review. So what I'm going to present next is the effect of decentralization in terms of public service delivery, but focusing on the education sector. But again, you could conceptualize this in terms of the health sector, water sector, sanitation sector, or like whatever sector in the economy that, is relevant to your country or setting. So in this case, why did we focus on the education sector? And there are like 4 motivations which are underlined by the fact that Sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest rates of education outcomes across all regions in the world. 60% of the youth between 15 and 17 years old are estimated to be out of school in 2021. And this also means that a fifth of children between ages of 16 and 11 are just out of school. And if we actually think of the gender dimension of it, it's more concerning because in 2021, 23% of girls are going to be out of school, which is high in itself, and also concerning if you compare it to 19% of boys. And then finally, 19 million girls between the ages of 16 and 11 in 2021 will never attend school, compared to 6 million of boys. So whether you care about boys or girls or both, we just see that a lot of young people and teenagers are going to be excluded. So this motivates like the reason for most governments to actually think that they can address this crisis by giving local governments powers to make decisions about education issues. And so what we're going to actually see next is whether that actually works or not. In the specific case of education, decentralization occurs through 4 different modes. One is either the central government through the Ministry of Education is going to give local government budgetary resources to spend money on what they think is appropriate or not. Second is where schools do have autonomy to make their own decisions. Third, the central government can actually decide to directly finance education establishments rather than sending money to local governments. And then fourth, you can have like the local community being actively persuaded to engage in school management decisions. And depending on either of these 4 modes of decentralization in the education sector, the commonalities is that this sort of decision-making processes being done by lower levels of governance means that they can hire and fire teachers or staff as deemed appropriate. They can make decisions on how to develop their curriculums. They can make decisions on procuring of education materials, such as textbooks, desk, chalks, and all that stuff. And finally, they can monitor the performance of teachers and see whether they're actually performing as they should do. So what did we do in this systematic review? It's a highly technical process. I'm just going to interrupt, just make sure you can hear me.
Yes, you can. That's a micro.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
Great.
So in terms of what we actually did in this systematic review is that we did conduct an analysis of studies that have been conducted in the literature. And this meant that we are like one to define what decentralization is, to define what is education outcomes, to determine the region of focus, and to have a such limit on what exactly are we interested in. So in the mode of systematic review, just to simplify things, what decentralization meant is fiscal decentralization in terms of budgetary resources. It's more of decentralization, devolution, delegation, as we defined earlier, as different modes of transfer of powers. And in terms of the education sector, it's more of school autonomy or administration of the school or education administration. Then also we had to determine what outcomes we are interested in. And in this case, we selected test scores because we're interested in what students actually score in their exams, because this gives an indication of the understanding of their materials. We were interested in enrollment in terms of how many students actually enroll and go to school. Enrollment here, you can see it's elaborated twice, one with a single L and two with a double L because of the English, British, and the US system. And what we wanted to do in this systematic review is to get evidence irrespective of whether studies have been published following the British or the American system of English. In terms of education outcomes, we were also interested in literacy. In terms of the region, it's Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, and the search limit was limited to studies that were conducted in English. So what did we get from studies that scholars have done in the last 10 years? So records which we identified from the internet were like 333. So these were like studies which have actually been published in some databases in either economics or political science. We were able to get an additional 14 studies which were conducted in the gray literature. 14 of these studies are also similar to these studies in the electronic basis. And some of these have been quoted in different databases. So after removing 60 duplicates, we came down to a record of 287 unique studies conducted in the African context on decentralization and education outcomes. Then the second step was to have a look at the titles and to sort of exclude studies that are irrelevant. And for instance, this could be studies that have been conducted, say, margin education and health outcomes. So those were excluded. And then we excluded 42 studies, just reading through the abstract to make sure that the title does not fool us, and we're actually limited to decentralization and education. And this led to a total of 45 articles. So going through each of these 45 articles, we were able to exclude 36, most of them based on other regions. So finally, there were only 9 studies that met the exclusion and exclusion criteria, implying that only 9 studies have been conducted on fiscal decentralization and education outcomes since 2004 in Sub-Saharan Africa. So these are the studies that we are going to focus on and try to see whether they can give us an idea of whether decentralization is good or it's bad for governance or public service delivery outcomes, as we saw earlier in the taxonomy that I did present. All right. So what do these studies tell us? One, they actually tell us that whether decentralization is good or bad depends on the capacity of local governments to mobilize local revenues. And like the study conducted by DADA in Nigeria actually shows that fiscal decentralization improves literacy levels in terms of test scores for students completing primary schools. And what does this mean? It means that those states in Nigeria that collect more local revenues are able to provide more education services without having to rely on transfers from the central government. So this is actually what drives the link between decentralization and good governance. And the theoretical mechanism is that when citizens have to pay local taxes, then they are more motivated to hold their local governments accountable. So the key mechanism is that if local governments are raising their own revenues, this is actually what drives decentralization and not just decentralizations per se. Other studies from the systematic review argue that whether decentralization improves literacy levels or not depends on its level of targeting. And what does this mean? So a study from Senegal shows that literacy levels in terms of test scores are higher when these fiscal resources are targeted to building human resources, such as teachers and principals in schools, and not purchasing school materials like chalks or blackboards or textbooks. So what these sort of studies imply is that we should not just focus on decentralization as a transfer of power, but we should actually think of decentralization in terms of targeting exactly what is that money being used for. And like the Senegalese case shows that if you target money to human resources, that has better outcomes compared to using that money for other education purposes. So targeting is the key aspect in this case. Other studies do focus on political factors. And the study that was conducted in Uganda shows that only 13% of those resources that were transferred by the central government actually reached the school level. So 87% of the funds disappeared. And this is because they were captured by local politicians, aka corruption. And in the Ugandan case, because resources are being distributed in a discretionary manner, also implied that communities that were better off received more money compared to those that were less off. And as a result, students in poor areas just had lower grades compared to students in richer areas because less resources implied less motivation for teachers to teach, and hence less outcomes. So again, whether decentralization is good or bad depends on the political context in which these reforms are being designed and also being implemented. So the final factor is that social issues do matter a lot in the context of decentralization. So studies that have been conducted in Ghana and Malawi actually show that even when local communities were being incentivized and motivated to engage in school management issues, this did not lead to good outcomes because community-based participation was dominated by local elites. So you can think of this in terms of like in a rural setting, and the school has to make decisions on whether to build a classroom or a borehole, and it invites the community. There are people who are more able to make decisions and sway decision-making processes compared to others. So this means that the decisions might not be fair. They might favor some group of students or not. And then also some of these studies show that some communities are just weak to monitor head teachers and students and teachers. Some parents do not have the capacity and the knowledge to evaluate whether teachers are performing or not. So before I move on to the next slide, which is the concluding one, what I'm going to sort of emphasize, scrolling back, is that whether decentralization is good or bad is not a white or black question, but depends on several issues. And this systematic review emphasized the role of local revenues in deciding like whether positive or negative outcomes occur, policy targeting in terms of whether the decentralization reform is actually targeted to specific issues or not, political factors, trying to understand like the political arena where decisions are being formulated, and again, thinking about social cohesion in terms of how local communities have the capacity to engage with schools to actually influence decisions. So to conclude, the systematic review sort of emphasized the challenge in evaluating decentralization reforms. It's not easy. It's not a yes or a no question. Otherwise, all countries in the world would have decentralized in a uniform way. The studies conducted in Uganda, Malawi, Ghana kind of showed there's variation in outcomes. So even when countries do have a uniform decentralization reforms, the outcomes can be different. And this is something that is not restricted to education, but also other sectors of the economy. So what we need to sort of learn and like the key takeaway points is that as researchers, as policymakers, we need to sort of think more of these preconditions. So we need to think about what makes decentralization work instead of thinking that decentralization works, if that makes sense. So what are the catalytic issues that can actually make decentralization work, rather than thinking that decentralization works as a magic pill. So that's one of the major outcomes of this systematic review. Second is that localized studies are important because they give us causal evidence, and as researchers have been done a lot of stuff on counterfactual, we need more studies and analysis at the local level to sort of get more understanding of the causal evidence and mechanism behind these governance outcomes. And then finally, and to conclude, we should be cautious about generalizing the effects of these reforms. So if they are working in some countries or some context or some specific time periods, we should not think of copy-pasting these reforms to other settings, but we should try to sort of understand what are like the theoretical policy mechanisms which do underpin their success or failure, and try to see how we can design better reforms rather than just a sort of copy-pasting one decentralization, devolution, deconcentration reform from one country to another. And then thank you for listening. I'm happy to receive any questions, clarifications, and most important, I just want to take this opportunity to make this session more engaging. So feel free to sort of share your experience and your thoughts, and we can sort of have an open discussion about that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then we can have an open discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mbate, for the insightful presentation. And I think most of us have learned a lot. And I invite everyone to key in your questions, or please feel free to raise your hand in case you have a question for Dr. Mbate. Meanwhile, I've shared NIERA's social media platforms just to give you just to keep you updated on our programs that we have lined up. This presentation is one among many that we have lined up on the findings that we want to disseminate on the systematic reviews that some of our members have been able to conduct. So please feel free to follow us on Twitter. We are at NIERA_EA. And on LinkedIn as well, we are at Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa. So we have an upcoming presentation also on the 4th of November on the climate and agricultural sector. So I will be sharing that information as well. This should be up on our social media platforms and on our website as well. Let me see if you have any questions so far. Okay, great. So I can see you have a question from Rachel Musitia, if I got your name correctly. So she says the presentation is good. Just a minute. My question is, how did Michael address the issue he highlighted that concerned definition and measurement of fiscal decentralization, analysis, and joint responsibilities? Dr. Mbate, I hope you got that.
Should I answer that, or should we collect more?
We can collect more if you would want us to do that. Great.
Okay, just say that again, and I'm going to note it down.
All right, so we have a question from Miss Rachel Musitia.
Yeah.
And the question is, how did Michael address the issues he highlighted that concern definition and measurement of fiscal decentralization, analysis, and joint responsibilities?
All right, okay, good, got it.
Great. And then we have a question from Abdurrashid Isa, and he's asking, what would you say about the impact decentralization on specifically learning outcomes. Let me come again. We have a question from Abdul Rashid. He says, what would you say about the impact decentralization, I think, has on learning outcomes?
Okay.
Those are the questions that we have so far.
Okay, I can answer them because they're actually sort of related in some way. Great. So the impact of decentralization on learning outcomes is complex. It's not one of the issues where you can say, yes, there's a positive impact, let's decentralize. And it's not an issue where you can say, no, there's no impact, let's not decentralize. You have to think about what do we mean by decentralization? Going to the first point about definition. Are we talking about deconcentration, delegation, or privatization? Are you giving local authorities or schools any powers to make real decisions or not? In the Ugandan context, for instance, local governments do not have powers to make political decisions, but they do get budgetary resources. So what does that mean? In the Kenyan context, counties do receive resources and they can make their own decisions. But the curriculum is designed by the Ministry of Education, which is in the central government. So what does that mean? And measuring those things because of the joint responsibility is not easy. But these are the things that actually do explain whether decentralization is good or bad. So the discussion should move away from decentralization or devolution as a reform to actually the processes, to the mechanisms, to the institutions involved. And it's actually those things that do decide whether these things matter or not. In the European context, for instance, you have countries like England where there's evidence that schools can make better decisions compared to the central government because they have information about the students and about the local community. So that works for them. But there are other countries where local governments or schools cannot be trusted with funds, even in the European setting. And why? Because of the factors that we discussed: social cohesion, political factors, targeted. So those are the kind of like the nuances that the systematic review tries to bring. And at some point, I think it could be discouraging or disappointing because there's no answer. But actually, that's the aim of this research, to actually show that the answers to these questions are specific, they are localized, and it's so difficult to generalize. And we have to be really keen on what we mean by even learning outcomes. It could be the case that decentralization increases enrollment, but it does not increase test scores. So you have more pupils going to school, either to get meals or whatever, but actually they don't score much in mathematics or science or languages. So even measuring all these aspects is challenging.
Good. Great, fantastic. I don't know if you have any other question. Let me look through the Q&A, but feel free to post your questions or raise your hand if you have any question for Dr. Mbate. Meanwhile, I can take this opportunity as well to just to just let you know the opportunities that we have for researchers and policymakers and program implementers across the region. So we still have our capacity building activities still going on. We have an impact evaluation. We have impact evaluation courses that will be delivered on 8 selected academic institutions and 2 research institutions in East Africa. Let me post the link to the project that I'm talking about. The courses should commence in November. And if you're based in any of these institutions, that is in Kenya, we have Kenyatta University, and you have JKUAT, Jomo Kenyatta University as well. If you're based in the 2 universities in Kenya and you're at a master's and PhD level, we do have impact evaluation courses that are coming up that will be delivered by our members based here in Kenya. In Rwanda, we have the University of Rwanda. So if you're based in the University of Rwanda and you're a master's student in the School of Public Health as well, you have an opportunity to get trained on impact evaluation. And in Uganda, we have Makerere University, the School of Economics. We have an impact evaluation training as well that will commence in January next year. And in Ethiopia, we have Debre Marcos University. We have our member as well who will be delivering the course come November this year. And in Tanzania, we have 2 institutions, that is the Institute of Social Work and Kilimanjaro Christian University. So we'll have our members, our 2 members as well, conducting impact evaluation trainings in the 2 mentioned universities. I don't know if there's any other country that I've left out in East Africa, but this is an initiative that we are implementing with the Utrecht University. So let me post the link in 2 seconds or so. Please feel free to interact with our website. I've just shared a link to that, and also our social media platforms, just to get updated on what we have in place for you in terms of programs and opportunities that you can pursue. Do you have any questions? You don't want to close anyone out. Feel free to raise your hand. We have a raise hand icon on the bottom bar there. Great. Well, we have a raised hand from Haran. Just a minute, you should be able to speak in 1 second. Great. Haran, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity. And apologies, I joined late, but this is a real good discussion. And then probably wanted to just raise something. I understand that the network is looking at the impact evaluation researchers in Africa. And also there is a petition that we are trying to sign to in terms of decolonizing adaptation in Africa. And probably with your permission, I was requesting if I'll be allowed so that I can also paste the link to the team so that they can also share with their network and also sign the petition. And we are looking forward to having a global discussion on in terms of adaptation, because we all know that for us to link research, we also need to look at the impact. So how are we going to evaluate the case? I remember there was a training that we did about the impact evaluation and looking at the counterfactual analysis. So the counterfactual analysis can only be understood if we all implement research and go back and look at what is the impact. So probably through this network, I was requesting the permission. I'll be able to share with, I'll send the email, and you can also send with the network so that they can be able to sign the petition, because we also need to, you are publicizing the petition until the president will be able also to be able to see the petition and be able to sign. Thanks, Santan.
Thank you. Thank you, Haran, for sharing that. Please feel free to post a link on the chat section so that the participants can get a grasp of what you've just talked about.
I mean, I just had like a quick one. There's somebody who appears like 82290152679. I was wondering like if people can put their names, because this is the aim of this webinar, not to be anonymous, but to sort of interact and create networks and get to know each other.
Absolutely. And if I can add on that, it would be good to have your name down so that even as we share the recordings and the materials, we can actually identify you and not close you out. So for the person named 822, please indicate your name, please. Great. Unless I don't want to leave anyone out, I think we don't have any more questions. Dr. Mbata, do you have anything to close the session with? Or
that's all for me. I think like the main takeaway points is like the two graphs I showed, just understanding that decentralization can be good and thinking about the channels through which this occurs, but also not being fooled, also understanding that there's another side of the coin, that decentralization can also be bad, and not being trying to get caught up in the extremes and trying to converge by trying to think of what could be the factors that explain why a certain local government, a certain municipality is performing better than the other. And I think if somebody has that framework, it can work for education, health, sanitation, water, irrigation, or whichever aspect of the economy you want to think. But I guess that's like the mechanism and the conceptual framework which the systematic review is trying to show.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And if I can add, just to add on that, and I think it's part of the NERA's mandate to ensure that we as a network and are able to influence the policy landscape, just being able to evaluate the environment and see to it that the programs and policies that have been put in place are actually evidence-based, and so that at the end of the day, the research findings are influence policies and development programming across the region. So I beg that to conclude the session at this point because I can't see any more questions. But let me say that we do have more presentations coming up. So keep an eye on our website and communications on emails, just to get involved in the sessions that we have lined up for you. So thank you very much for joining us today. That's it, Dave. That's it from us, from myself and Dr. Mbate. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Fantastic.